Hey, good afternoon, everybody. I am so honored to be with you. This is one of my favorite organizations, and I am particularly honored to have Anne introduce me and recount the very painful circumstance in which I met her and her husband, Andrew, and their son, Colin. But they are a remarkable family, and all three of them serve the public in their own way, and all three of them have taken that horrifying experience being involved in the tragedy at Virginia Tech and used it to elevate their advocacy and their compassionate outreach to others. So please give Anne another round of applause for the work that she does at the Child Fund. So my message to you, USGLC, is now more than ever. If you did not exist, we would have to create you right now. And in some ways, the fact that you do exist, the fact that you were formed, the fact that you've grown. I was happy to welcome Liz and the USGLC to an event in Richmond in one of my first years in the Senate on the Foreign Relations Committee. The fact that you're growing and thriving, I think it's for a moment like this where we're grappling with I think, a painful budget proposal. I just came from the Foreign Relations Committee hearing on the budget with Secretary Tillerson. The size and scope of the proposed cut of our development, diplomacy, and aid budget, I think, would be very, very wrong-headed for the United States. But it's an important moment not only because of this budgetary, it's an important moment because we're grappling with so many challenges around the globe, and we're also grappling with the need to be more persuasive with the American citizenry about the value of U.S. engagement. And you are ambassadors, small A ambassadors, for the proposition that things go better for the United States and things go better for the world when we invest, not just treasure, but also our time and our talent. I have a piece that has appeared today in Foreign Affairs called The New Truman Doctrine, and I just want to share with you what I've been thinking about, and it's heavily based on this piece that I started writing a year ago, because it's not just relevant to your mission, you are uniquely situated to advance something that must be advanced for our country right now, I'm convinced. One of our senior military leaders that I often hear testify before the Armed Services Committee said something to me about a year ago that really stuck with me. He said, "Tim, we have O plans, but no strategy. Operational plans, but no strategy. We have operational plans for every contingency that anyone can dream up. But if you try to find the organizing theme, the strategy that links them together, the view of America's role in the world circa at that point 2016, we don't really have it." That was during the previous administration, and I would argue that the same point is even more so true today. We're in a moment of time where 70 years ago, in a very, very challenging political environment, a Democratic president decided to articulate a strategy, and a Republican Congress decided to embrace it. And the strategy that was embraced, that was known, that we call it the Truman Doctrine, lasted for 40 plus years during presidencies and Congresses of both parties. And it's interesting to think about that, to ask the question of whether that would even be possible in 2017. Could you articulate a national security strategy for the United States, a global security strategy, a definition of the role we play in the world? Could you do it? Could you get bipartisan support? Could it last past one administration? The Truman Doctrine was sort of four things that combined together. First, Prime Minister Churchill, not Prime Minister now, was invited by President Truman to come to Westminster College in Missouri of March of 1946, and he gave the speech that we think of as the Iron Curtain speech. The title of the speech was "The Sinews of Peace." That was the actual title of the speech, but he basically talked about what the world was circa 1946, a U.S.-led Western bloc, a Soviet bloc, with international institutions that were not yet strong enough to protect against war and to promote freedom rather than tyranny. And he put on the shoulders of the United States what he called an awe-inspiring responsibility to the future. It was a year later, in March of 1947, President Truman, having invited Churchill to come give that speech, needed to come to Congress in a low probability proposition. March of 1947. Truman had just lost both houses. In fact, he'd been shellacked. Both houses had been Democratic since the early Roosevelt administration. Truman was so unpopular in the midterms, no Democrats even wanted him to come near them. They lost both houses. It's 1947. The Republicans are feeling great. They've just humbled this Democratic president. And by the way, America is very war-weary after World War II. And by the way, there are so many pressing domestic priorities, from inflation to housing to economic challenges, as people are coming back from working overseas. How do we expand the economy to accommodate them? And President Truman is faced with a dilemma. The Soviet Union is trying to destabilize the governments of Greece and to a lesser degree Turkey, governments west of the Iron Curtain. What do I do about it? And President Truman went to Congress. He looked in the eye of a body that had just humbled him in a midterm, that was certainly not poised to work together with him, and he said, look, we've got to be about defeating war and promoting freedom in the world. If the United States doesn't do it, who will do it? I've got to ask you, war-weary though you may be, focused on domestic priorities as you may be, I got to ask you to invest first in propping up these governments, and then later when George Marshall in June, just 70 years ago last week, came to Harvard, rebuilding the economies of Western Europe and eventually rebuilding the economy of Japan. What a tough ask for a Democratic president to make to two Republican houses that had just humbled him. But as you know, the Republican Congress said, we'll do it. They debated about the Marshall Plan, we'll do it. And that basic doctrine of the U.S. leading a Western bloc vis-a-vis a Soviet Eastern bloc became an organizing principle that was accepted wisdom by both Democrats and Republicans, both executive and legislative, till the fall of the Soviet Union. Remarkable. If anybody despairs about what we might be able to do across the aisle, it wasn't any easier then. In fact, I could argue that it was harder then, that the probability of it working was lower then, and it's important to grasp that and ask the question whether we could have such a strategy articulated in a bipartisan way that would be proactive and that would last past one administration. Since the Soviet Union's come down, I think we've been in kind of a wandering case-by-case mode. Case-by-case analysis has some virtues to it. If you don't have a grand strategy, you may run less risk of getting blinded or forcing the facts into paradigms where they shouldn't naturally fit. And we've seen successes in the case-by-case mode during the Clinton administrations, the Good Friday Accord, during the Bush administration, during the Obama administration. There have been some successes from case-by-caseism, but there's also been failures. When you operate case-by-case, sometimes looking back, well, first, it's hard for your allies to know what you'll do. It's hard for your adversaries to know what you'll do. It's hard for your citizens and troops to know what you'll do. When you operate case-by-case, you look backwards and say, why did we intervene militarily in the Balkans and not intervene militarily in Rwanda to save lives? Why was one humanitarian crisis one that really called on our attention, even in our military resources, and not another one? And when you ask that question, looking backwards, some of the answers that appear are not very comforting. President Bush, after the attacks of 9/11, articulated a theory of a global war on terror, but that was too narrow a theory for us because it leaned heavily on our military might, but it didn't really take advantage of the fact that American might is also about the economy and about trade and about the strength of our moral example and about diplomacy and about development. And when the rationale for the Iraq War, the destruction of WMDs, turned out to be inadequate, that sort of global war on terror as an expression of a compelling national strategy faded, even though terrorism is still a central challenge. I'm a huge supporter of President Obama, but he continued case-by-case, even reactivism. President Obama famously said, when asked, what's your strategy? Don't do stupid stuff. President Obama is a very non-doctrinal, non-ideological person. He tends to view doctrines and strategies as getting in your way, blocking the way that you look at challenges, and he would rather deal with it in a case-by-case way. But I've said often before, the problem with don't do stupid stuff is it can lead you to not do stuff that it's stupid not to do. Or the old Catholic in me would say, a don't do stupid stuff strategy may lead you to minimize sins of commission, but it can often maximize sins of omission. And as we look back at a presidency that did many wonderful things in reinvigorating diplomacy in Cuba, moving frozen relationships in Cuba and Iran at least to a next chapter, no guarantee about the way they'll go, but moving them to a next chapter, we also have to look at the continuing horror in Syria, the refugee problem, the civil war, the humanitarian disaster, civilian deaths, and the United States and all the world would look back at that and say that was a missed moment where more definitive action could have dramatically reduced human misery. And so the question that I grapple with, and the question that I think many of you are grappling with, I was just looking at the topics for the seminars and breakout sessions this afternoon, is, okay, we just came through a campaign where a lot of rhetoric about reducing our commitment to the world was embraced by a lot of voters who think we're maybe doing too much in the world. So what is the strategy circa 2017? What can we say about our engagement in the world and proclaim and do it proudly in a way that will have us playing the right role, but that will also grab the imaginations of people not in this room, of people not connected to the GLC, but who I think stand to benefit from hearing your message? I think the starting point for the analysis is the same starting point that Churchill put on the table in March of 1946. He described the world as it was at the time. What is the array of power in the world? That was the starting point for the Truman Doctrine. You got to do that first, and we live in a different world today. It is not a Soviet-dominated Eastern Bloc and a U.S.-dominated Western Bloc. That's not the world we live in. I would say, as a politician, I'm an oversimplifier, but I would call it a tripolar world, not a bipolar world. And the tripolar axis of power is democracies, and the good news is they exist on every continent. And they're thriving democracies on every continent. And the bad news is we often take democracies for granted and think they're going to be fine, but weaknesses in democracies are apparent, whether it's growing anti-Semitism or populism or fiscal crises in the Eurozone. But democracies exist everywhere. The second form of government that is waging a competition, that's trying to convince others that this form is better than democracies, is the authoritarians. I think specifically of nations like Russia and China and Iran and Turkey to some degree, authoritarian nations that are trying to recapture a day that they thought was a better day and project it forward. But even, especially in the case of Russia, they don't just want to be powerful. They want to undermine the notion that democracy is a functioning form of government that can work and solve the challenges of the 21st century. That's part of the project that they're on. And the third power source in the world that Truman wasn't really confronting is non-state actors. ISIS, Al-Qaeda, the Sinaloa cartel, Al-Shabaab, transnational corporations that are able to evade accountability laws and taxes by structuring, NGOs. A lot of the non-state organizations, including corporations and NGOs, do great work, but the fact and reality of the power of non-state organizations, non-state actors, is a very different thing circa 2017 than it was in the world that Truman confronted. And so for the United States to have and conceive of a role in the world right now, we really have to grapple with the role of the democracies, the role of the authoritarians, and the role of the non-states. And of course, our primary work should be shoring up the democracies. Democracies need a champion right now. The virtue of the democracy over the authoritarian nation is no longer self-evident, with active measures underway to undermine the perceived effectiveness of the democratic model. And so democracies need a champion, and there's no better nation to be a champion than the United States. What do I think the U.S. should do in this moment to seize that mantle and champion small d democracy here and around the globe? I'll say first, we got to be a little humble. And we're being humbled right now. Our reputation around the world is being hurt. I last week met with the new Spanish ambassador to the United States. I met with Knesset members, and I met with the English National Security Advisor, and that was just last week. I could give you the list of who I met with the week before as a member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And again, as I meet here or travel, it's like, what's going on? Are you guys stepping away by getting out of the Paris Climate Accord or not agreeing to commit to Article 5 collective defense under NATO? Are you stepping away? Many of these folks asked me the same question during the Obama administration. I'm not saying that these questions have just come up since January 21st. I think they've accelerated, but they were asking me these questions. They were asking me these questions in the previous 8 years. So we are being humbled, but there is an opportunity in being humbled, and that opportunity is to step back and assess, are we resting on our laurels? Are we relying upon doctrines and platitudes and bromides that were appropriate in another era that aren't appropriate today? One of the things I would most love to do is to scrub the phrase indispensable nation out of our thought process about the United States. That is a famous phrase of a dear friend, Secretary Madeleine Albright, who made that comment after the collapse of the Soviet Union in the 1990s, and it was arguably true at that point that the United States was indispensable. And it was certainly true, the phrase was not a Truman phrase, but it was certainly true in the 1940s, but it's just not true today. Charles de Gaulle said, "The graveyards are filled with indispensable men." It was a warning. You think you're indispensable, but you're mortal just like anybody else. You think you're the best, but you could make a mistake tomorrow just like anybody else. The notion of indispensability carries with it a hubris, a belief that we've got to be involved in everything, and if we're not, it can't work out without our involvement. So I think the first thing we ought to do is think about our role in a different way, and I would scrub that notion and substitute it with exemplary. Let's try to be exemplary rather than indispensable. Let's try to be exemplary based on our equality value, the Jeffersonian principle. Let's try to be exemplary based on our free press in a world where journalists are being put in jail. Let's try to be exemplary in our embrace of equality, including marriage equality, in a world where LGBT citizens are being put in jail in multiple continents. We are exemplary in an economy of innovation, of you can fail and still try again. In many countries, that's not so obvious. This USGLC, with representation from the private sector and the NGOs and the military and diplomacy, you all are exemplary in your own ways, in your own sectors. And the world could stand some good examples right now. Instead of trying to be indispensable and be in everybody's business, let's just try to be the best at what we do so well. And by doing that, we will set an example that is more likely to be persuasive. And frankly, it's more likely to make us indispensable if we just try to be exemplary. That's the first thing we should try to do, is accept some humility, be better listeners, shed some hubris, and try to be exemplary, live up to those foundational values. I'll tell you a foundational value that's really important. Here's a foundational value, just like the equality principle was Jeffersonian. Here's another one. Jefferson wrote in the Statute of Religious Freedom in Virginia in 1780 the basic concept that historian Gary Wills says was unique to us. Much of our Constitution was a borrowing job of great ideas from elsewhere, but here was something that Gary Wills and others saying was sort of unique to us. You can worship as you like or not, and you will not be preferred or punished for that choice. It became the free exercise clause in the First Amendment of the Constitution as Madison pulled together what should be in the Bill of Rights. In so many countries, people of different religions are at odds or can't live in the same communities, and we've generally made it work here in this country. That is not to be taken for granted. That is under jeopardy. There's still too many instances of anti-Semitism and anti-Muslim behavior, and Sikhs being treated badly because people think they're Muslims. There's still too much of this, and it's kind of escalating, but we stand for an exemplary proposition that we gave to the world in terms of our tradition of religious acceptance and tolerance. So that would be a first thing that we should do as part of a national security strategy. Focus on our own example and just try to be true to it. Second, militarily, I had a hearing this morning with head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Joe Dunford, and Secretary Mattis. We're kind of moving in our military relationship with the world from protector to preferred partner. We can't be the policeman. Our budgetary realities won't allow us to be the policeman of an entire globe, especially as other nations' military investments increase. That's tough to do. But I got a kid in the military who's in the Marines, and he is in an unusual specialty. He's an infantry commander, but he's kind of gotten diverted a little bit into training foreign militaries, because militaries all around the world want us to train them. They're dealing with terrorism. They're dealing with human trafficking. They're dealing with conventional warfare. They're dealing with civil unrest. They're dealing with poaching. They need somebody to help them, and who do they turn to on every continent for training assistance? From the European Reassurance Initiative on the border with Russia to nations throughout Africa, they ask for the United States to help. And when we train their militaries, we're not just training them on the military, we're training them on the law of war. We're training them that torture is wrong. We're training them on other values, respect for civilian authority over military authority. This role for our military going forward, and we have so many people in the room who have served so honorably in the military, is emerging as one of the most important things we do, and it is a fraction of a fingernail of the budget in the DoD, what we do to train foreign militaries abroad or bring their leaders here. Third, we've got to be a rule builder, not an empire builder. There's breakout sessions this afternoon about trade and about global norms. The effort to say that the U.S. hasn't gotten anything out of being the rule builder since the 1940s is ridiculous. What we have done to be the architect of this system of rules, norms, and institutions has been good for the United States, and it's been good for the world. Just look at life expectancy around the world, driven so often by American medical innovations. Look at our own economy's progress. Being connected, whether it's through trade deals or the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, to mention a perennial one that is too controversial for Congress to address, even though Secretaries of State and Secretaries of Defense say we should. If we focus on being a rule builder, not an empire builder, and we commit more to things like the Paris Climate Accord and NATO and other organizations, things are going to be better for us and better for the world. Humanitarian leaders, so many of the NGOs here, you know this. When something bad happens in the world, whatever anybody thinks about the United States, whatever they're griping about, they call us to ask us to be there first to deal with Ebola in Africa. They call us to ask us to be there to deal with tsunami relief in Asia. And that portion of our budget is so small, and yet the value that it produces is so big. We should never, ever back up from that, because that's who we are. That's our instinct and our motive, and that's who the world sees us. And finally, as we think about the role of the United States, a thing of mine, and then I'll then conclude, is I really think we have to have what I call a north-south correction. American foreign policy has operated as if it's on one axis. Generally, it's an east-west axis. We worry about Europe. We worry about the Soviet Union or Russia. We worry about China. We worry about the Middle East. We worry about Japan. There's notable activity by many of you in the United States, north and south, but just using the Americas as an example, our foreign policy around the Americas, the Monroe Doctrine, that wasn't really about the Americas. It was keeping Europe out of the Americas. We were deeply involved in the Americas during the Cold War, but it wasn't about the America. It was about keeping the Soviet Union out of the Americas. We had a spike of interest in the Northern Triangle when unaccompanied minors were coming in droves, but as soon as those numbers went down, we turned our attention elsewhere. This budget proposes to reduce commitments to the Northern Triangle and reduce commitments to Peace Colombia, even though Colombia has transformed from a nearly failed state into one of the U.S.'s best and most cooperative security partners in the hemisphere. We've got to have a north-south foreign policy in this country that is every bit as robust as an east-west foreign policy, and that's something we should commit to do. But the last thing I'll say is this, and this is something you know, and this is why this organization was founded. Any proclamation of American greatness has got to be built on our goodness. And any promise of greatness with no evidence of goodness is hollow. It's hollow. I have loved being in the Senate and serving on the Foreign Relations and Armed Services Committees because I get to look at the interaction of the United States in the world, drawing upon my experience as a missionary in Honduras, looking at it from the different angles, military, foreign policy, diplomacy. Of all the things that I've seen during the time I've been in the Senate, the thing that just kind of struck me the most in a very visceral and emotional way It actually happened before I got in the Senate. But it was a picture, and I've talked about this before when I've been at the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition. It was a picture of the USS John McCain, a Navy ship named after Senator McCain's grandfather, docked in Da Nang Harbor in August of 2010, paying a visit to Vietnam to commemorate the 20th anniversary at the time of 15th anniversary of the reestablishment of normal diplomatic relationships between the U.S. and Vietnam. And I just looked at that picture of the USS John McCain with the entire with the entire Vietnamese military brass saluting and welcoming it there. And it just struck me that, wow, in my lifetime, just, 30 years ago, here we were at a war, 60,000 American lives lost and thousands more injured, and their names are right here in Washington, and a war that cost millions of Vietnamese lives. Millions. And yet here we were at a moment in time when what Vietnam wanted deeply and what Vietnam wants deeply is they want a good relationship with the United States of America. That speaks to an amazing magnanimity of the Vietnamese people. It speaks with a deep fear of the influence of China in the region. But it also speaks to something about us, something about who we are when we're at our best. When we are at our best and we're reaching out and we're making mistakes and we're overreaching because we're human and we put our self-interest first because everybody does. But still, what people want in this world is they want a little more of our attention. They want a little more of our time. They want a little more of our influence. And isn't that something that just makes you so proud to be American? And we can do that if we wisely invest this widow's mite that we put into the budget for global affairs, the combined budget for global affairs that you fight and champion. It may seem like a moment where either the rhetoric of some or the popular desires of the electorate are telling us to cut back, but that's not what great leaders have done in the history of this country. Whatever the prevailing winds, they've plowed ahead. We have to think about what the right role is, and the right role will be different than the right role in the 20th century. We have to solve some divisions. Had we not solved the division that led our country to be split north and south, had we not solved it through a civil war, a painful war, and a painful aftermath, we would not have been able to do what we did in the 20th century. We would not have been able to defeat fascism. We would not have been able to jump into World War I and help end a pointless war. We wouldn't have been able to defeat communism. We unified as a nation, and then 40 or 50 years later, history had something for us to do that we couldn't have done had we not been unified. History has something for us to do in the 21st century too. And we'll only do it if we take on that responsibility and conceive of a role. And right now it doesn't seem that likely here. But it's no less likely today than it was in 1947 when President Truman went to an unwilling, hostile Congress and asked them to do something hard. And he made the case, and Congress did it, and it lasted for 4+ years. Why should we expect less? Why should we expect less of a president and a Congress today? You don't expect less. That's why you're so valuable today. And I really appreciate the chance to come and be with you. Thanks so much, and have a great rest of the summit.